Well, the Alberta teachers' strike has reopened the debate in Alberta about public funding of private schools. We'll delve into both sides of that debate up next on the Line Alberta Podcast. Well, greetings, folks, and welcome to the Line Alberta Podcast. My name is Rob Breakenridge. Thanks for joining us here this week. A look this week at the issue of education funding in Alberta. Now, as we record this, Alberta teachers are still on strike. There are some talks resuming this week between the Alberta government and the Alberta Teachers Association. So maybe, hopefully, there will be a breakthrough to end this strike, get kids back into school. And it's certainly a big focal point in this debate and this whole situation has been Alberta's levels of education funding. Alberta has fallen to the lowest in the country when it comes to per student funding. And that's tied into a lot of the concerns that teachers have about classroom sizes and just the overall pressures on the system and the stress that creates for educators. Now, somewhat related to that, though, is how Alberta deals with education beyond public schools, specifically when it comes to private schools in Alberta. Now, Alberta has a diverse mix of schools. There's the public system. There are actually charter schools that kind of technically fall within the public system. And then there are private or independent schools, and that's academy-type schools maybe people think of when it comes to private schools. There are other schools that do deal with special needs or certain learning needs, others that are religious in nature. Where Alberta is unique is that some tax dollars do follow students. So basically, it's about 70%. So you look at the per student funding in the public education system, and a student who then goes to a private school would still have about 70% of that funding follow them. So dollars are going to private schools, although they are following the student. But I think that's been a bone of contention for a lot of folks, is that we are underfunding public education, yet somehow there are public dollars available for private schools. Now, again, this isn't necessarily specific to the teachers' strike. The teachers haven't demanded anything with regard to private schools, but on the whole question of overall education funding, it does have some relevance. And it's come to light in a couple of high-profile ways lately. The same day we learned the teachers had rejected the most recent offer from the province, there was a whole controversial incident at the last Alberta Next panel in Calgary, where a grade 12 high school student tried to ask a question about this very issue and was kind of shouted down or admonished by the panel moderator, who cut off the kid's mic, even suggested, maybe this kid hadn't been sufficiently spanked growing up, which later prompted an apology. But he was trying to ask a question. Why are we, devoting hundreds of millions of dollars, public dollars, to private education in Alberta when we've got all these challenges in the public system? And one of the other ways it's come up lately is a petition effort that's being launched. And this is interesting because the Alberta government, which I don't think is inclined to want to change its funding model around private education, they do have a system, though, where if citizens want to raise an issue that maybe the government doesn't want to raise, they can do so in the form of a petition. And if enough signatures are gathered, that can prompt a referendum. Now, maybe people are more familiar with this in the context around the separation debate, where right now there's a petition drive underway. There's efforts on the separatist side to form a petition, a referendum question, worded a little bit differently. But this does exist as a tool in other policy or legislative areas. So the Chief Electoral Officer in Alberta has now formally approved a petition, which would put a question to Albertans: should we end public funding of private schools? And I think in the context of what we're seeing around pressures in the education system, the teachers' strike, and everything else going on, there's a lot of emotion around this issue, but I think people are paying attention to this issue. People have strong feelings on this issue. It is philosophical almost in some ways. How much public dollars should go toward private education? Now, here's the thing, right? I mean, people who have deep pockets are always going to be able to afford a private education. And the argument in favor of Alberta's model is that this still gives some flexibility to families who want that choice or maybe want a different kind of option for their child's education. And having some of those dollars follow the student does give some of that flexibility. I think defenders of public education, though, would say if we were sufficiently funding the public system and addressing some of the challenges there would be less reason for those kids to leave in the first place, less reason for parents to seek out a different kind of education. But again, because the dollars follow the student, if we were able to convince those students to come back, those families to come back to public education, the dollars would follow them. So the 70% of the cost that goes toward the private education would be 100% of the cost back in the public system. So there would be additional cost. And I think that's something to factor in. So we'll hear that side of it a little bit later on in this episode, the argument in favor of Alberta's approach, or the more or less the status quo. Now, again, there's nothing that precludes the Alberta government from putting more resources into public education, paying for more teachers, paying teachers more, building more schools, and just increasing that per student funding. The Alberta government could do that. It's not an either or. The Alberta government doesn't have to cut funding to private education to support public education. But I think there is, as mentioned, that sort of philosophical debate about where do folks stand when it comes to public education in Alberta, and what should that mean? Because Alberta certainly does more than other provinces do when it comes to making public funds available to private education. So, like I say, we'll get a different perspective on that a little bit later on in this episode. But up first, a conversation we had with the Calgary high school teacher who has launched this petition effort, which they're hoping will lead to a referendum on this question. Alicia Taylor, as mentioned, a Calgary chemistry high school teacher. I caught up with her. Here's that conversation. All right. Well, joining us for more on this petition campaign and some of the debate around education funding in Alberta, very pleased to welcome into the line Alberta, Alicia Taylor, who is a Calgary high school chemistry teacher and the organizer of this petition drive. Alicia, thanks so much for making some time for us here.
Thanks for having me.
Let's just start. I mean, as we sit here recording this, I guess we're kind of on the eve of maybe some bargaining restarting between the province and the Teachers Association. I know it's been just a real stressful time for teachers and a real stressful lead up, obviously, to this whole labor disruption. Just kind of where's your headspace at, and what are you hearing from your colleagues as well?
We're all just hopeful that there will be a better offer that's brought forward by the government this week.
Yeah, it's unfortunate it had to come to this. I think it's a tough situation for so many people in Alberta. But it kind of feels too like, I don't know, has this been a long time coming? It just seems like a lot of these issues are really built up and it just kind of boiled over almost.
100%. Yeah, the shortages in the classroom funding weren't all at once, and we were able to manage dealing with a little at a time, but we've come to a breaking point, and myself and my colleagues aren't going to stand it anymore.
Yeah. So we'll see what comes of that. And I know, just so people understand, I mean, this issue around private school funding isn't necessarily a part of the talks. It's not something that, teachers are asking necessarily. But I guess what do you see as the connection here when we look at overall education funding in Alberta, the fact that Alberta now has the lowest per student funding in the country? Do you think there's a connection there?
There's a loose connection for sure. I think the reason this initiative came out in the first place was because myself and my colleagues, the people that I talked to, were frustrated to see resources going towards public schools when there aren't enough resources for our public schools. And so it's not connected necessarily to the bargaining and the strike, but it's definitely the same type of issues that are prompting both.
Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting use of this tool that it's actually the Alberta government that made this available, this idea of petition to generate a referendum, which I don't think is a policy they necessarily wanted or expected to come before them in this way. But give us a bit of the background, because I think, as I understand, this has been in the works for a little bit.
Yeah, so about a month ago, a group of us got together, my idea, but a group of people working alongside me to help craft a question that we thought could support the needs of public education. And once that was ready, we did apply for the citizen-initiated petition, and that was now about 4 weeks ago.
So you submitted that application. I guess it's up to Elections Alberta, the chief electoral officer, to review this. So now that it's been given the green light, I guess you're not quite at the starting point in terms of collecting petitions, but this was an important step. So what happens now that the chief electoral officer has given the go-ahead?
Now that we've got the go-ahead, I have been able to appoint a chief financial officer and submit paperwork on their behalf, which has been done. That was due on tomorrow. It's due tomorrow. And so I expect to hear back from them as to whether that has been approved, at which point they will issue me the petition and we can begin our work collecting signatures. So you'll need about 180,000 signatures, and those are signed in person by people that have credentials. So my work over the last week or so has been to get people, as many people as possible, signed up to collect those signatures.
Mm-hmm. And I think because the rules changed a bit, I know there's this petition going around right now, the Forever Canadian petition, which is actually kind of under the old rules. So as you mentioned, just under 180,000 would be the threshold. And I think it would be 120 days, right?
Exactly. Yeah. 180, it's 177,000 signatures in 120 days. We're going to aim for higher than that just to make sure that we have everything covered.
And so tell us what the question would then be.
The question is, should the government of Alberta continue its current practice of funding accredited independent private schools?
So a simple yes, no question. That would be a referendum. I think, you look at some of the mood right now. I mean, we saw tens of thousands rally in Calgary and Edmonton just over a week ago. So I think it's a pretty passionate audience for this issue and for this kind of a message right now. Is that your sense?
That is my sense. Of course, there's people reaching out that don't agree on my thoughts about public funds towards private schools, but most of the people that I've been talking to are really supportive.
Well, talk about why you see that as something that needs to be addressed, because I understand it, like dollars follow the students. So, if students were coming out of these other schools, they'd be coming back into the system. So there is still a cost there on that side, right?
Yeah, I don't disagree with the idea of private schools. However, I believe that if you're attending a private school, you should be paying for it with your own money. The public schools should be funded better so that they can support the needs of more of our students.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. I mean, the Alberta government, it's definitely been a deliberate decision on their part to allow per student funding to fall to the point that it has. I guess they could still increase that. Like, it doesn't have to necessarily be connected. Like, they could also make a conscious decision, regardless of what they do on the other side, to say, what, we are going to increase that funding.
Yeah, I suppose. I guess it's a philosophical thing for me. I believe that public dollars should go towards public schools, and those public schools should be funded to support all of our learners. If it's not addressing your needs still, and you have a special needs, you want a more elite type of a learning experience, then that should be coming out of your own pocket.
Right. And I think there are those elite, expensive academy type schools. I think there are those that do cater to special needs students and different kinds of learning needs. And, for some parents, it is a sacrifice to make those decisions. How does the system need to address those concerns, do you think?
I think that the community school should be able to address the learning needs of all students. Students with special needs should be supported in their community school, just like any other student.
All right. So once this petition is officially launched, would there be a website or a way for people to find out more about it, or how to get involved, or how to sign? What should people be doing if they want to learn more about this?
Well, we're working quickly on getting a website up and running, but for the time being, people can contact me by emailing me info@abfundspublicschools.ca.
All right. Well, it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out. I think it's a debate a lot of people are paying attention to. Alicia, do appreciate you making some time for us here, and do appreciate your perspective on this.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
All right. Well, joining us now for more on the ongoing debate in Alberta around education policy and private and independent schools, very pleased to welcome into the line Alberta, Catharine Kavanagh, Western Stakeholder Director with Cardus. Cardus.ca is the website. Catharine, great to have you with us here.
Thanks very much for having me here.
First of all, let's establish what we're talking about. I know we hear the terms private schools, independent schools kind of interchangeably, but it is quite a diverse landscape in Alberta, isn't it?
It really is. So the independent school sector is pretty wide. We're talking about schools that often serve children with disabilities. Here in Calgary, we have schools for students specifically who have autism. We have schools for students with high learning needs. We also have lots of schools that serve different philosophical approaches or ethnic communities, different religious communities, and just different pedagogical approaches. So the independent school sector is really geared towards making sure that there's a best fit environment for every child.
Right. Because I think when people hear private school, we think of these sort of elite academies. And I mean, those do exist, but is that a pretty small percentage of what you just described?
It really is. So there's definitely a lot of myths about independent schools in Alberta and across the board. But the reality is here in the province, it's less than 9% of independent schools that even qualify as, say, an elite or a top tier school, those kind of more stereotypical ones with competitive admissions or high tuition. The other 91% are typically these smaller community oriented schools. And these are the ones that fill the gaps left by public schools. They're the ones that can meet community needs with more flexibility, more responsiveness, that are able to just be a little more adaptable.
Yeah. Alberta has charter schools too. And I mean, that does give a different kind of education option. Those kind of exist, though, basically within the public system, right? So they're a little different.
They are. So charter schools are defined as public charter schools. They are responsible directly to the minister, and they are required to offer a very specific pedagogical approach that isn't offered in another setting. So that's where you get, say, the Calgary Girls' School or the Classical Academy. And they differ from public schools in that they are not allowed to charge tuition, they differ from independent schools in that they're not allowed to charge tuition. They're not allowed to be religious, and they do have different reporting requirements. And then they receive 100% of the per student funding, whereas independent schools receive only 70% of per student funding, so actually represent a cost savings to Alberta taxpayers.
Right. And I think that's an important point. This proposed referendum question of whether the government should stop allocating money to private schools. It is important to know that I guess it's not direct grants to schools per se. I mean, these are dollars that follow the students.
They are. So the way it works in Alberta is that students are funded, not systems. And so, yes, for every student that attends an independent school, we save 30%, which works out in real numbers to about $4,000 per student per year. If we aggregate that, looking at right now, we have about 48,000 students in independent schools. That represents about $190 million in savings every year. And so not only are independent schools good for students, they also represent, obviously, I guess you could say fiscal prudence. And ultimately, they take the pressure off of public schools as well, because they leave more resources, which are already in the public school system, for students that are attending those schools.
Right. And it's been pointed out many times that Alberta does have, for public schools, the lowest per student funding in the country. And I guess people can debate where that number needs to be, but if those students in private or independent schools came back into the public system, that would represent a cost increase then.
It would represent a cost increase. We've run some quick numbers, and it looks like it would be close to an extra $100 million a year. Besides the cost increase, it would also definitely be a logistical hurdle. I mean, we'd be looking at extreme space demands. The province would need, let's say, if even half of those 48,000 students were priced out of their current school and had to go back to a Catholic or a public or a Francophone school. So we're looking at 24,000 students. We'd need at least 24 new schools, each one accommodating 1,000 students, essentially built overnight. And we're already in this space crunch in Alberta. So those 24 new schools would be on top of the 100 schools that the province is already building and prioritizing over a 7-year period to accommodate our existing space challenges. So independent schools really are part of the solution here and not the problem.
terms of who's using or making use of independent schools, because I think this gets into the argument too, that even if it's a lower per student subsidy, it is still a subsidy. And I think a lot of people think or it's perceived that we're basically subsidizing wealthy families.
Yeah, so that's another one of the myths for sure. We know that when it comes to the demographics of independent school families, the parents who send their kids to an independent school are usually not wealthy families. They're much more likely than your average Albertan to be more, say, blue collar, or to be nurses, farmers, or really even teachers themselves. And when we look at their incomes, we know that they're more likely to have below average household incomes, again, when compared to an average Albertan. So really, the government funding that is available for independent school students is providing the most help to those families and those students that are from lower or middle class backgrounds.
I mean, the subsidy is the same, I guess, regardless of the school or what their focus is or what their tuition is. Would it be doable or conceivable to have some kind of a means test? Or, I mean, is this the most straightforward way of administering it, do you think?
I mean, there are lots of ways that funding could be administered. I think already kind of the system works in a way that that allows parents to prioritize what's important to them. So yes, if there's a school that offers different programming and has tuition costs that reflect that, they receive the same per student subsidy as everybody else. I mean, their parents are taxpayers, the students are Albertan citizens no matter what, but the school is free to charge higher tuition, and then parents are free to decide whether they want to pay it or not, or whether they prefer to send their child somewhere else.
I mean, it does seem like we sort of have right now where, as mentioned, the dollars follow the students. So parents are taking their kids from public schools, putting them into independent schools, and that is raising that funding component a bit. I mean, is there something, though, to be said for trying to find a balance? I know the government's been criticized for not putting enough into public education, and does it kind of have a snowball effect? If problems are mounting in the public system that puts strain on public schools, parents are looking elsewhere for options.
Well, I mean, certainly pulling funding from independent schools and potentially pushing those kids back into the public system, that would just exacerbate the problem. Mm-hmm. So we'd definitely be really open to a conversation where we could talk about improving education for everyone. I mean, we could talk about how we can spend more fund, or how we can fund the entire education system better. Yeah. But I think parents are looking for options because their children's needs are not necessarily being met at their neighborhood school. And it's not good for that child, or really for Albertan society overall, if that child is struggling and, maybe can't read, doesn't have basic numeracy skills, for example. And so really the effect, both for individuals and for everyone, is so much better when parents have the option to find a learning environment which does work for their child.
Well, that's the thing, right? And it is subjective, in terms of what we want our education policy to be or what kind of options do or should exist. But as you say, then there is value in having different options, different kinds of education, giving families choice.
Definitely. And I mean, we can look at some examples of children who go to independent schools. There are those children with autism who just need extra time, extra support, different means of kind of reaching them in order to get those concepts across. There are, say, new immigrant families whose kids need more help mastering English in some cases. There's also just, again, those different pedagogical approaches can really make or break success. There is, say, teenagers who maybe they just can't sit still through like a math lesson in a textbook, but as soon as they're introduced to it in some sort of real life way, whether that's like carpentry or sports or something, those concepts become alive and they understand it instantly, and they can take that into other spaces. So again, like having these options, these choice, this diversity really does benefit everyone.
Yeah, and even if we put more resources into public schools, I don't know that the public system can serve all of these different kinds of needs. It just can't be everything for everybody, can it?
Exactly. So public systems are just big systems, and there's just only so much flexibility that can exist within those big systems. I mean, if you look at the Calgary Board of Education, they have over 100,000 students. It is nearly impossible for one entity to meet the needs of 100,000 students. And as teachers always say, even within one classroom, you've got 30 completely different personalities, 30 completely different kind of approaches, ways of learning, things that work best. And so that's why, despite the best efforts of teachers and administrators and systems, that's why sometimes these these children with different needs aren't able to have them met in these neighborhood schools.
Right. It's interesting. Different provinces have different approaches, and there are private and independent schools that exist elsewhere. But how unique is Alberta in having this kind of an approach?
So Alberta definitely has the most diverse array of options, which has always been one of our hallmarks in this province, and one of the things that certainly appeals to people about living here. To compare, BC, for example, does have independent schools as well. They are funded at a different rate, but they don't have a public Catholic system. Their support for homeschooling is less. They don't have charter schools. And then if you look at, say, Ontario, they have no funding for independent schools whatsoever. So for parents who really do need this kind of different educational option for their children, they are faced with a significant financial burden that is out of reach of most families. Whereas here in Alberta, because we have this support for these different educational choices, it's the more vulnerable families that are then able to access the help they need.
Right, that's the thing. The wealthy or those with means, well, they'll always have options, right?
Yeah, so this is something we talk about a lot. Wealthy families will always be able to access what they need, whether they go to an independent school or say a public school. If for families with means, you're able to access tutoring if you need it. If your child's falling behind, you're able to pay for extracurriculars if you want your children to have other kinds of experiences. And then you're able to pay for tuition no matter what it is, if that's the kind of education you want your children to have. And so it's the poorer families or the less fortunate families that are the ones that have fewer options. And this kind of funding makes sure that menu of options is wider and more open to them, and that their children aren't left out.
Yeah. Well, with this teacher strike and concern about public education, it's politically kind of volatile right now. I think, over 90% of kids are in the public system. So there's this whole other side that I think a lot of families maybe don't fully understand. And you talked about some of the myths and stereotypes that exist. What is the risk of us going into, if we do this kind of a referendum campaign, and what do Albertans really need to know about our status quo?
I think the biggest risk would be that too many of the myths are taken as facts. It's one thing to present a narrative where all independent schools are wealthy and elitist, but we know that's just not true. And we know it, as I've been saying, vulnerable students that are helped most through funding like this. So we're really concerned about the potential of this referendum because it could have a lot of negative impacts on a lot of Albertan families, especially those who really need help the most. So the student with special needs, new immigrant families, children who have social anxieties. So this is a big risk. And ultimately, it risks taking away something also that is so integral to Alberta and to what has made this province great for so long. And even if we look at, say, like international rankings, Alberta ranks number 2 in educational standards, right behind Singapore when they look at subnational jurisdictions as well. That's a record to be proud of, and there's certainly room for improvement. But I think it's more than fair to say that part of the reason we have those high standards is because of the vast array of choices in education that we have, especially our independent schools.
Right, some important points. We will see where this debate goes from here. Much more is mentioned, cardis.ca. Catharine, appreciate your perspective, and thanks again for making some time for us here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, so once again, that was Catharine Kavanagh, Western Stakeholder Director at the think tank Cardis. Cardis.ca, Cardus. And our thanks as well to Alicia Taylor, Calgary High School chemistry teacher, the organizer of this petition that could potentially lead to a referendum in Alberta on the question of whether the province should keep funding private education in the way that it does. And look, it wouldn't surprise me, as I said, you look at the number of teachers, over 50,000 of them on strike. You look at the tens of thousands that attended rallies recently in Edmonton, Calgary, and elsewhere. There's a lot of Albertans who are pretty passionate about this. So it would not surprise me if this petition effort over 120 days is able to gather, 177,000 signatures. And how this goes in a referendum, I think it's an interesting question, too. I don't know which way this would go. You've got about 90% of kids in Alberta who are in public schools. So I think, there's a lot more on that side that just kind of see it from the public side or maybe are frustrated with the level of support or funding for public school maybe don't quite understand how things are on the private side of things, or maybe have those beliefs or stereotypes about wealthy families and those wealthy kind of elite academies, which again, I mean, do exist, but I don't think that's the full picture of private education in Alberta. But it just, in this kind of an atmosphere right now, I think it's kind of all bets off if this does get to a referendum. And look, I don't think the Alberta government has helped either side here. I mean, I think supporters of having those options, having choice in education, do support the Alberta government and their policy. But I think the way the Alberta government has gone about it by allowing things to get to the point they have in the public system, I think that's fostered a lot of that frustration and resentment toward the private side of things, and why I think it could be such a wild card if it did get to a referendum. So ultimately, look, if the Alberta government believes in choice in education, having charter schools and private schools and having some of those dollars follow students, then I think it's incumbent on them to make sure they're addressing some of the challenges and pressures on the public education side. And look, I mean, Alberta has grown by leaps and bounds. Now, I mean, the Alberta government has encouraged a lot of that growth, but still, it is, in fairness, a real difficult position when you've got young families flocking to Alberta just trying to keep up in terms of having enough schools and in terms of having enough teachers and addressing all of the various challenges in the system. But that's a responsibility the Alberta government has to deal with. So like I say, as we record this episode of the podcast, it sounds like talks are set to resume between the Alberta government and the Teachers Association, but who knows if anything is going to come of that. I know teachers want to get back to work. I know parents are frustrated. They want their kids back in school. So let's hope we get a resolution on that. But like I say, even if we do, we've still got this petition campaign about to kick off, and that could prompt a referendum on this question of education funding in Alberta. So we have not heard the last of this debate. Anyway, much more. You can follow us, of course, at alberta.readtheline.ca. Again, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast here. My name is Rob Breakenridge. This is The Line Alberta, and we'll talk to you next week. Take care.